Hello everybody, welcome to another Wednesday video. This week, as you can probably guess from the title, we're going to be discussing something that does involve naval history, but something that exists a little bit higher above the water than, at the waterline itself. And that's going to be the Seafire, the navalized Spitfire variant of World War II. But of course, why should I talk about this when I can find an expert who knows far more than I do about the subject? So, well, by the looks of things, I've managed to find one. Perhaps you'd like to give yourself a little bit of an intro to the viewers.
Hello, I'm Matthew Willis. I'm a writer and historian, if I can call myself that. Sort of focusing really on naval aviation, with a bit on the naval and a bit on the land-based aviation side, but mainly naval aviation. My background is I did an MA in history and cultural studies of science, rather than a straight history degree. So being a bit weird and multidisciplinary, which has kind of affected my outlook on things ever since. Went into journalism for a bit, and then sort of started writing on this sort of subject full time about 2007, and have been sort of scraping away at that ever since.
Fair enough. And of course, relatively recently, you've published a book on the Seafire itself.
Yeah, that's from Morton's, their Tempest imprint, and it's the first in a Fleet Air Arm Legends series, actually. So there'll be more naval aircraft coming along from that publisher.
Well, that's good to know. And of course, link in the description for those of you who don't have the book. And well, you really should read it because I read it cover to cover the day I got it. It was very interesting. So I guess we'll lead in with the first question, which relates to the obviously everything related to the Seafire. So in 1939, you have the Skewer, which is the Fleet Air Arms sort of fighter, I guess you can call it that, and the developmental line for two-seat monoplane fighters like the Fulmar and later on the Firefly is ongoing. But at the same time, the RAF is in the process of inducting the Spitfire and the Hurricane into service. So was the Royal Navy actually looking at a single-seat Seafire at that period of time?
Not seriously, although things were developing quite quickly in terms of the Navy and its requirement for a single seat fighter. I think to understand this, you have to sort of go back certainly to the early 1930s, if not really the late 1920s, when there was this sort of path of divergence that started between what the RAF wanted from a fighter and what the Fleet Air Arm wanted from a fighter. Which was it started off as roughly the same kind of thing, and what they wanted from it diverged to the point where in 1939 you have this two-seat 225 mile an hour fighter. They call it a fighter. It was a dive bomber fighter, and that was the order in which its roles were constructed. And as a fighter, it was expected to be kind of a patrol aircraft that would be operating against enemy shadowing aircraft and maybe the odd bomber. Not that the Fleet Air Arm was really expecting to operate within the range of land-based aircraft, or it hadn't back when these aircraft were conceived. If you go back to sort of the late 20s, the early 30s in the RAF, when they were starting to come up with this idea of the interceptor fighter, when they were moving from the idea of zone defense to sort of point defense, and a fast climbing fighter that could sort of leap off its airfield and catch the bombers, on their way to the target. And it had to be fast, and it had to have a great climb rate, and range wasn't terribly important, and having lots of equipment wasn't terribly important. The ability to navigate wasn't terribly important. And you switch to over the sea, suddenly those priorities are very different. And if you're escorting aircraft a long way, strike aircraft a long way, you need to be able to navigate. So with the technology of the day, you need someone in the back seat doing that navigation work. And having spoken to Fleet Air Arm observer quite recently, and he took me through the ways in which Fleet Air Arm aircraft navigated before you had a lot of electronic and radar guided aids. It was incredibly complicated and basic, and basically involves dropping something on the sea and then performing a very a strict flight pattern around it, and then using various mechanical tools and mathematics to figure out where you are and where you're going. And you need another person to do this. The pilot can't do this. So the back seat is very important. So you've got these priorities that are very different. Whereas at the time, sort of early to mid 30s, the performance difference between a two-seater and a single-seater isn't that significant. So you also get this point where the Fairey Fox bomber turns up and it's faster than the fighters, and then a little bit later the Hawker Hart light bomber turns up and it's faster than the fighters, and they turn the Hart into a fighter, which became the Demon, and then there was a naval version of it, the Osprey, and this was found to be incredibly useful. So this line of two-seat fighters kind of comes from that point and that process where the two-seat fighter had capabilities that the single-seater just didn't, and its performance wasn't that much behind it. Whereas then you get this kind of big burst of aircraft development in the second half of the 1930s, when you get aircraft like the Spitfire and Hurricane, and on the other side the Messerschmitt 109 and aircraft like that turn up, and the gap between the single seat and the two seat suddenly starts growing quite exponentially. And you also then throw into that this issue where the Fleet Air Arm has to have multi-role aircraft because it has such a restricted number of airframes. It's a very, very small service compared to the RAF. And they've decided doctrinally that they need to get more than one role out of each airframe. So the fighter has to be, we won't talk about dive bombing because that's a whole different conversation. But the fighter has to be able to do proper dive bombing, not just carry a few light bombs and put the nose down a little bit, and actual proper Stuka Douglas SBD style proper very steep dive, very accurate dive bombing with a large enough bomb to make a difference. And the Skua has to do that, and it also has to do this role, has to do a little bit of fleet defense that they think will be required. It also has to be able to do reconnaissance, because all the aircraft have to do reconnaissance because we're the Navy. And so you end up with this point where high performance single seat fighters aren't really thought of as being terribly useful until really on the eve of war. And then at the beginning of war, they realize that, the Skua is not really going to be sufficient against enemy bombers, certainly against enemy fighters, which, because of the shifting sort of geopolitical realities in the 1930s, you've gone from a war of protecting trade routes in the deep ocean, possibly against Japan, someone like that, to whoops, we're going to be fighting probably in the Mediterranean, certainly against the sort of rising capability of the Kriegsmarine, maybe in the North Sea, possibly the Atlantic, but there are going to be more encounters with enemy aircraft, and we need something that can actually fight. So the first suggestion of using something like the Spitfire in that role, it sort of arises around about 1939. There are two routes to it, which is quite unusual. The first is that there's a specification for what's intended as the Skua replacement, which is specification N839, which comes right at the end of 1939. And that starts out as a two-seat aircraft, really just furthering on from the Skua idea. And the Fulmar, which is a sort of interim aircraft, which is coming along at the same time, but it's really in the same sort of league as the Skua, just with slightly better performance. And a turret fighter, which, big idea for about 5 minutes, and then it gets dropped. And into 1940, the Admiralty and the Air Ministry realize that this, they've got this fairly significantly wrong. They still like the idea of the two-seater, but now they're working on, they think actually we do need a single seat fighter for fleet defense as well. And they ask the companies that have submitted to N839 to resubmit their proposals with a different, with better focus on performance, and with a two-seater and a single-seater, preferably based on the same basic design if possible, but not necessarily. And Supermarine, because Supermarine, for their proposal for the single-seater, they propose an aircraft that's based on the Spitfire. It's fairly significantly different in a number of ways in order to make it suitable for naval use. Most notably, it's to be powered by a Rolls-Royce Griffon, which at the moment is an aircraft, an engine that is reserved for the Admiralty. The Admiralty commissioned it, and it was meant to be their engine. And obviously, later on, the RAF comes along and snaffles it like it does everything else good. So you have this first sort of navalized Spitfire. And that doesn't last terribly long. The Admiralty likes it, but there's an alternative proposal from Fairey, which they like slightly better, and they decide to go along that route. But at the same time, Winston Churchill, who's then the First Lord of the Admiralty, so he's in charge of the Navy, basically at a political level, he decides that the Fleet Air Arm needs to be doing more than it's doing, needs to be shouldering some of the burden of the RAF, because the RAF is really kind of gearing up for this big home defense fight, a big kind of fight on land against Germany at the time. Home defense is the bigger thing because we're getting into the Battle of France now and things are looking a little bit shaky. And so Winston Churchill decides that the Fleet Air Arm should take on the role of fleet anchorage defence and dockyard defence from the RAF. And the Fleet Air Arm needs aircraft to do this, needs fighters to do this. So there's a proposal that they take a small number of, 50 is the number that's suggested, and the Spitfire is the aircraft that's suggested. But the Fleet Air Arm, being the Fleet Air Arm, has to get maximum use out of its airframes. And it's decided that really, ideally, these aircraft would have to be able to be operated from a carrier as well as from a shore aerodrome, which is how they will be used in fleet defense. And also there's this sense that you can be able to take them on a carrier and take them over to somewhere like Singapore and either operate them from the carrier or disembark them from the shore. But they will basically be for this fleet defense role. Fleet anchorage defense or dockyard defense. And so there's this idea of a sort of modest navalization. It has to include wing folding at this point, that's still an absolute red line for the Royal Navy. They can't take out, they're really not keen on taking aircraft without folding wings for various reasons. Supermarines comes up with a proposal. They fiddle about, find a way of folding the wing, fitting an arrestor hook and catapult spools and things like that. But at this point, the Air Ministry jumps in and says, if you're going to have 50 of these navalized Spitfires, that will cost the RAF 200 standard Spitfires. And at this point, Winston Churchill says, okay, that's, appreciating the big battle is going to be on the Western Front. We can't afford that. Supermarine themselves thought it was only going to be about 75, but the Air Ministry didn't want the Navy having its Spitfires. So that point, really sort of early in 1940, that gets kiboshed. And that's the first sort of false start at the Seafire.
Fair enough. That's obviously a lot earlier than historically most people consider the Seafire being in the Navy. Now, I've seen some artist impressions of the thing, and it looks almost slightly gull-winged. So it's obviously a bit more adapted for naval purposes than the historic Seafire would end up being. And I believe you mentioned in your book there was also sort of a last-ditch attempt to save the proposal that involved using, was it a Centaurus engine or something like that?
A Sabre.
A Sabre.
There was the Napier Sabre was there was a sort of, because the Sabre was, everyone loves the Sabre at the time. It was sort of, really before it got into its quite troubled development. This was going to be the really important engine, and it offered it's a really compact engine for its power, but it offers a big increase in power. So for naval aircraft where you need to carry more fuel, you've got more equipment, a powerful engine is quite attractive. The problem with the Sabre proposal was that you're going to need to modify the aircraft quite a lot more than with the Griffon, which, as it turned out, indeed, with the Spitfire, you could adapt to the basic Spitfire airframe without too much modification, whereas the Sabre would have needed, quite a lot further back in the fuselage. And then when you look at the, I can give you I think it's in the Spitfire, the history by Morgan and Shacklady. I think that's the book it's in, but there's a small drawing of this, the naval proposal, which, as you say, it's gull-wing, which is quite an interesting idea because it allows them to shorten the main undercarriage, which is obviously a big strength issue on deck landing. And the leading edges of the wings are pushed out as well. It's got a wider chord, and that's where they put the fuel. The fuel is all in the leading edge of the wing. Which again later similar thing would be done on the photo reconnaissance Spitfires, but it's quite a different. There's quite a lot of modification. They move the radiators into the central under the fuselage, but I think really kind of the back of the fuselage from the cockpit back is Spitfire, and most of the rest of it is pretty new. So I think it would have taken a while to get into service. But it would have potentially solved a lot of the problems that we later got with the Seafire. That was a less dramatic adaptation of the design. So it would have been interesting to see what happened with that. But and even then, things like wings that folded back along the fuselage rather than the over the top. It was quite a different proposal. And it was ranked first on technical merit in some of the discussions about those proposals, but in the end, for various reasons, it just lost out to the Fairy, which became the Firefly after a lot of hacking about and chopping and changing and really kind of messing up what was attractive about the aircraft in the first place. But that's a different story.
Yeah.
But it's you get a sense of just kind of how tangled the business of procuring naval aircraft, particularly naval fighters, was just before the Second World War. And it's not a good situation to be going into a war with, where you really don't have your procurement properly sorted out, your doctrine properly sorted out, the concepts for what a fighter looks like and performs like. And they're doing this on the hoof, and they're doing it on the hoof for the whole of the Second World War. And the Seafire is quite symptomatic of that.
Yeah, I mean, I must admit, when I first read that, given how much power the Sabre would later put out, and how heavy airframe they'd stick that thing in with things like the Tempest, it did amuse me greatly, the idea of a late war Seafire with sort of a 3,500 horsepower Sabre somehow just rocketing into the sky.
Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of thing where, it was like the propeller would stand still and the aircraft would be revolving almost. Yeah. It would be, if you didn't have contraprops on something like that, it would have been really difficult in the landing. You'd have had so much torque and so much issues with swing, and it would have been challenging, I think.
Yeah. So that's kind of the death of the first possible Seafire. And then so the Royal Navy is then obviously left to contend with Fliegerkorps 10 and the Regia Aeronautica in the Mediterranean, the Luftwaffe more conventionally in the North Sea. And then even in 1941-42, you've got to worry about Zeros and so forth.
Yeah.
And the best they can put up is the Fulmar, which is, I mean, it's creditable enough taking out bombers, but it's not really going to tangle with a Zero or a BF-109 any time of day. Yeah. Which obviously a properly navalized Spitfire could have done. So when do they look back and go, actually, maybe that whole navalizing the Spitfire thing wasn't such a bad idea, and they start to, I guess, at some point they revisit that proposal.
Yeah. Churchill comes into it again, and this is really after after the Norwegian campaign and getting into the Mediterranean, there is a bit of a détente and a bit of the Air Ministry is slightly more prepared to let the Fleet Air Arm have adapted RAF designs, and so you get into the Sea Hurricane, which the RAF very reluctantly allows the Fleet Air Arm to have some aircraft from its stocks for modification, and this sort of, they're expected to kind of get by with that aircraft and with small supplies of better fighters from America. But Churchill goes to visit HMS Indomitable, one of the new armoured carriers, during its workup phase. And when he gets there, he's quite shocked to discover that the fighter component of Indomitable's air group is going to be made up of Sea Hurricane Mark I, which is literally the same aircraft that was fighting the Battle of Britain. And sorry, this is late 41. Churchill is making this visit. A year before, when the Hurricane Mark I was just about competitive against the BF 109E, and you're expecting a year later the same aircraft weighed down with naval bits and bobs is expected to be competitive, and Churchill is bothered by this, and demands immediate action to get the Fleet Air Arm the latest fighters. And this is what really kickstarts the sort of the process of navalizing the Spitfire, which had gone a certain way but had been on ice. And then at this point, it starts moving pretty quickly, as it does when the Prime Minister says, "I want action now." And then so you have a proposal. Again, it's the initial modification is quite a basic one. The Fleet Air Arm by this point has accepted that it can't always get folding wings on aircraft, so it's prepared to accommodate aircraft with fixed wings in various slightly creative ways. The Royal Navy's never been big on deck parks, but it kind of now has to adopt small deck parks. On some of the carriers with smaller lifts, they've put outriggers so they can store the aircraft on the main flight deck, but with the tail hanging out over the sea, just so you create a bit more space. And the newer, the illustrious class sort of Group 1 carriers, they all get outriggers, so they can carry about half a dozen, well, initially Sea Hurricanes and then fixed wing Seafires. So it's really, it's a very basic modification. Work starts on it quite quickly. By the end of 1941, you have a conversion prototype, and very early in 1942, the first deck landing trials take place on HMS Victorious, with the Lieutenant Commander H.P. Bramwell makes the first landing. And really by this point, conversions of existing Spitfires are already taking place. The name Seafire arises at this point. It's the wife of one of the Supermarine team who are working on the development. The normal kind of convention for naval adaptations of land-based aircraft is you just stick the word sea before it. This is quite a new thing. The Sea Gladiator, I think, was the first aircraft to have adopted this, and then you get the Sea Hurricane. And there were other aircraft where it didn't quite work in the same way, but Sea Spitfire is a bit of a mouthful, so Seafire, it works. It's a nice name, and it's, it suits the aircraft. And they're starting to adapt the first, which is a Spitfire Mark V's. The 5B is the first version to be modified, and this turns into the Seafire 1B. And it's really just a basic. It's got a hook on the rear fuselage. Doesn't even have catapult spools, and it has a bit of naval equipment such as radio. It's really a bare minimum conversion, but because the need is great, they start working on this quite quickly. In sort of early 1942, they're starting to come through.
Okay, so then obviously, so that's your initial almost emergency variants.
Mm.
And then I suppose they're looking at something approaching a slightly more navalized one, maybe with some folding wings as well. So how rapidly does the Seafire start to be deployed once they've got past that initial sort of slap us tail hook and a radio in it and call it a day phase?
Mm. Considering the usual speed of development, it's pretty quickly. So you have the first deck landing in January. You're getting squadrons are sort of starting to be equipped with it around the sort of late spring, and they're starting to learn the trade and work up. They don't quite have it really when it would have been incredibly useful in the Mediterranean. You have the big series of Malta convoys in the summer, sort of summer and late summer of 1942. So you've got Operation Harpoon and Operation Pedestal, particularly Pedestal in August, which is in September. Sorry, just around about that, just the turn of the autumn in 1942, which is when you really need air defense, and it's hugely important. And it's Pedestal in particular that really kickstarts that's really the point at which they start pushing very heavily on getting the Seafire into more and more squadrons, because the main fighter on that operation was still the Sea Hurricane 1B, now 2 years after Battle of Britain. They had a few Grumman martlets, a few Fulmars still in operation, but it's the Fulmar is really it's not a thing you want for heavy duty fleet defense. They had a small number of them that they used for sort of low level, because its advantage was it had longer endurance, so you could put them in the air and leave them there in the patrol, whereas the short range fighters you have to keep launching and landing on and launching and landing on. But the Fulmar is on its way out at this point. The Sea Hurricane, that's reached its sort of its high point, and it's particularly its armament. It's only got 8 303s. It's not enough anymore. So you need something with cannon like the Seafire and a really good performance, because the Sea Hurricane it was not even the bombers it was fighting during that convoy, the Savoia Marchetti, I should say, sorry, get the pronunciation right, SM-79 and the Junkers 88, were both really faster than it at some altitudes, and they were too fast for it to catch unless they had a good interception point. So the Seafire, then the big drive to get it into service comes after Pedestal in the sort of autumn of 1942, and there's a really big push to try and advance things and get the conversions going quicker, and just to sort of try and push this process, because they're, although despite all the priority, the Navy is still somewhat at the back of the queue, and you've got advantages and disadvantages of using a common aircraft with the RAF. Economies of scale, spares, and things like that, and the fact that the factories, the problem that kept happening with naval aircraft was the resources kept getting taken away for RAF aircraft. So it's okay, we'll use the same aircraft, but then you get put to the back of the queue with those aircraft and any sort of conversion work and modification work and things like that, which was but the stops came out of that after Pedestal, and lots of squadrons started getting new squadrons equipped with the Seafire, or existing squadrons re-equipped with the Seafire from sort of September 1942, that was this point. And you mentioned the development, actually. The Seafire 1B, which I mentioned initially, which was the basic modification. Very quickly after that, you have the Seafire Mark II, which is similar, but has catapult spools, so it can be launched with Royal Navy catapults, which is quite a big deal if you're in low wind conditions, or if you want to launch a more heavily loaded aircraft. And then the Mark II Seafires, they get the C model wing for the for the Spitfire, which is the universal wing, which it's sort of more easily modifiable in terms of its armament, and you can carry bombs and things like that. And then there was a sort of additional model of the Mark II, which gained a sort of low-level specialist engine. So this was the Merlin 32, which is optimized at low level. Most of the Fleet Air Arms work takes place at low level. It's sort of focused on ships and surface ships and so on. So it tends to be at a lower level than the RAF was working at. And the Seafire Mark II-C was a real hot rod. Had fantastic performance, especially at low level. It was still a fairly basic modification, no folding wings, but it was a great performer. It was it had a really impressive air-to-air performance, which was what the Fleet Air Arm needed. Well, a little bit earlier actually, but it needed it at the time. And the version with folding wings was in the works. That was coming along, but we won't see that until a little bit later.
Fair enough. So at that point, I guess we're talking sort of late 42, early 43. How is the Seafire stacking up against both the aircraft that I guess it's competing for deck space with? So the last full Mars, maybe early Fireflies, Martlets, which for American viewers, yes, they're Wildcats. We just decided to call them something different. And then, of course, other aircraft it's competing against. So the Americans are starting to deploy the Hellcat. The Japanese have sort of mid-mark levels of 0, etc. So where's the Seafire ranking in performance terms now?
In terms of out-and-out performance, you'd have to say it was up there with the best of those aircraft in terms of things like speed, agility, climb rate, acceleration, things like that. In terms of armament, it stacks up pretty well as well. 220mm cannon and 4 303 machine guns. So that's a heavier broadside than something like a Hellcat, better than the Fulmar, which the later models got 450 cal machine guns, which sort of up their sort of hitting power a little bit from the 8 303s. But then, its big shortcoming is endurance. It's got a much shorter range than the Fulmar, the Firefly, the Hellcat, the Zero, that will continue to be a problem for it until really quite late in its Second World War career. It's fragile, which is less of an issue for it in the air than it is getting the thing back on the carrier deck. And this is the thing that's perpetually a problem for the Seafire, is actually landing the bloody thing. For various reasons, sort of inherent in its design, it's not a good deck landing aircraft. Really partly what makes it so good in the air, so a very slippery design, a very low drag design, that elliptical wing, which helps make it excellent at high altitude because of the low induced drag when angle of attack increases. When you're in a naval aircraft, when you increase the angle of attack, you really want a lot more drag because you've got to slow the thing down to get it onto the deck. And British naval aircraft, they've been talking, as late as 1940, they've been talking about, an absolute maximum of about 70 knots landing speed, which means, you've got to be able to slow the thing down, a considerable amount. So, and the Spitfire just can't do this. Not easily, and not with the existing design. And then added to that, you have quite a fragile undercarriage, quite an unsteady undercarriage with a narrow base. So it's again, the thing you want to do with a naval aircraft when you bring it into the deck is when you chop the throttle, you need it to fall really, and to just settle nicely onto the deck. You don't want it to skim like an air hockey puck until you meet the barrier, which is what tends to happen with Seafires. If you don't really catch the hook first time, if you're a little bit too high, then it's an unpleasant few yards, unfortunately. So that's the main issue. I mean, particularly the American designs, the thing that Grumman managed to do, which is something that no British authority or designer really considered was possible much before this is that you have an aircraft that's got good performance in the air but isn't compromised by landing on the deck. And I think you get in the discussions between the Air Ministry and the Admiralty before this, there's this sort of assumption that if you've got an aircraft that's good at operating off a carrier, it will necessarily have a lower performance. Which is sort of, it's a shame they didn't catch a look at how Grumman were doing things a bit earlier on, really, because I think that would have changed a lot of minds in the authorities in the UK. And with things like the Hellcat, it has the advantage of having an enormously powerful engine. So obviously, the more powerful engine you've got, the more with those other characteristics you can play with. So the more fuel you can carry, the more ammunition you can carry, you can have a bigger wing and still get a good performance out of it. Yeah, I mean, in some ways the Seafire is right up with the very best. In other ways, it's pretty compromised. And that does come through in some of the operations that it's required to take part in during its career.
Yeah, I remember reading, I think it might have even been in your book, that when the Eastern Fleet, later the British Pacific Fleet, deploys, even the Spitfires that aren't or Seafires that aren't breaking their backs on landing, when the maintenance is going on, they're noticing there are cracks in the airframe from the stresses of the landing, and they're having to kind of bodge in patches and extra strengthening plates just to make sure the thing doesn't fall apart the next time it hits the deck. And a quite high attrition rate going on as well.
I mean, in terms of the first sort of during the Salerno landings in autumn 1943, that's the occasion that's generally quoted as being really throwing a spotlight on this attrition issue. And you mentioned actually just the sort of the airframe strengthening quite early on in the Seafire's career. It was realised that there was this you could virtually bend the airframe if you land it too heavily. So if you look closely at pictures of Seafires, if the light's right, there's like a fish plate that's sort of the length of the fuselage that's sort of riveted alongside out on the outside of the fuselage, on the outside of the longeron, just to give it a bit of extra strength there, which is not the kind of thing that would instill confidence in pilots, but it was a case of needs must. So I think on D-Day of the Salerno landings, there were 65 serviceable Seafires. By D+3, they were down to 39. I think over the whole of the Salerno operations, there were 73 Seafires that were written off or seriously damaged. Another issue was the propellers. They kept losing propellers because when the aircraft would land, because of the positioning of the arrestor hook on the rear fuselage, fairly close behind the cockpit, you had this tipping force when it caught the wire. So the aircraft would tip forward and peck its propeller on the deck, and they were losing a lot of propellers. And the modification to deal with this was to saw 3 inches off each propeller blade, which luckily they had the wooden blades they were using, so it didn't actually affect the performance too badly. That was the bodge that they used to. There were a lot of bodges with the Seafire. I mean, it's quite remarkable, really, the sort of Heath Robinson stuff they were doing to get this fighter into service. And one of the best examples is with the flaps. Now, the Spitfire has no takeoff flap setting. You're expected to just take off without flap from your nice wide grass RAF aerodrome, and put the full flap on for landing, which is 90 degrees to the airflow, and that slows you down. It's no good for takeoff, too much drag for takeoff. So rather than try and rework the flap system with an interim setting, they used a solution that they'd used when they were flying off Spitfires to Malta, which is they fashioned wooden blocks at 18 degrees, a wedge at 18 degrees, and closed the flap onto this wedge. So you then had an interim flap setting for takeoff. Then when the pilot had taken off and everything was okay, he had to sort of pop the flap open slightly, the wedge would fall out, and then he could close the flap. So it's, it's a pretty clever solution, but it's not, it's not the stuff of which dedicated naval fighters are made. But sorry, I've kind of drifted from the main question, I think.
No, that's fine. I mean,
remind me where we were.
We were talking initially about the comparison between the different contemporary fighters, but considering the next couple of questions were what were the major issues and strengths of the Seafire, I think we kind of just nicely segued into those anyway. I mean, I think one of the sort of coming on to the strengths of the Seafire, if I remember correctly, once again, late war, once you get out into the Pacific, I believe it was being used very much as a point defense interceptor because it had the capability to get up there and tangle with the enemy far faster than something bigger and heavier like a Hellcat could.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the sort of the initial phase of the British Pacific Fleet, it was very much the sort of go-to fighter for combat air patrol. This is, I think, largely because you had these sort of more specialist low-level versions of the aircraft by then, and they had the one advantage that the Seafire had, particularly with these low-level optimized engines, was phenomenal acceleration. So it was extremely good at catching the kamikazes when they were when the fleet was off the Sakashima Gunto, doing its sort of airfield denial raids. The Seafire was really the best aircraft for that point defense role, where it could it could be in the right place at the right time when the kamikaze were directed, because obviously they would kind of come in at low level and then pop up. They would split into small groups to confuse the radar. So there were a few sort of initial slips with this, but then once they got the system worked out, and the pilots got a bit more experienced, there was sort of a day where they kind of intercepted something like 6 raids that were coming in on the fleet, and none of them sort of penetrated through to the fleet, and it was they were working it quite effectively. Certainly by the end of Operation Iceberg in June 45. When Indefatigable, which was the main carrier that was operating the Seafires out in the British Pacific Fleet in that first phase, they right at the end of that phase, that it was considered that the maximum number of sorties, Seafire sorties per day, was 56. This was a sort of theoretical maximum, and initially they were getting nowhere near it. But right at the end of that phase, they did a day where they managed 59 sorties. So it was actually they got the deck landing accidents down to a very low level. They were turning around the aircraft very quickly. It had become a very effective interceptor.
Yeah, and I suppose that brings us on to the sort of the big question that hangs over the whole of the Seafire's career. So it's got its strengths, it's got its weaknesses. It's doing a pretty good job, certainly once they've worked out all the issues with it, and then it kind of just vanishes off the face of the earth almost immediately after the end of the Second World War.
I think, well, partly, actually, I mean, just to sort of at the end of the Second World War, but particularly when Implacable turns up, and their air group manages to scrounge a supply of 90-gallon drop tanks, which were for P-40s. I think they find them on New Guinea, and they kind of acquire these drop tanks and scrape the rust off and stick them on Seafires. And this suddenly turns the Seafire into a much more effective long-range aircraft, and it's at that point capable of more long-range escort and even some sort of strafing attacks on the Japanese homeland. So they kind of figured this out right at the end of the war. And then just after the war, I think part of the problem for the Seafire is that you've got this new model coming in just as the war ends, which is the Mark 15, which is the first of the Griffin-powered Seafires. And this is again, it promises a big step up in performance. It should be a kind of really important weapon within the Fleet Air Arms Armoury. But there are, as typically with the Seafire, there are a lot of development problems with it. And there are issues with the engine where it can lag on acceleration, which is the last thing you want in a naval aircraft. So, Rolls-Royce have to come out and try and sort that out. There are some issues with the wing skin, which are not, which is, insufficiently strong in places. So you get some pretty unpleasant characteristics at high speed. There are a couple of aircraft lost because the airframe's overstressed just from fairly normal kind of flying operations. So they have to kind of back off with the Seafire and just kind of work out these problems before they can really start using it in earnest again. And then the other issue is you have more dedicated naval fighters coming through at this point. So you've got the de Havilland Sea Hornet, which is sort of coming through into service in the few years after the Second World War. And then most of all, the Hawker Sea Fury, which is really the definitive piston-engined naval fighter. And it sort of has the same strengths as the Seafire, but it really eradicates most of its weaknesses. By the late 40s, the Fleet Air Arm is really sort of moving in a direction of standardizing its fighters on the Sea Fury, and by this time we know that the jets are coming as well. So the Seafire does hang around. There are some improved models. The Mark 17, which is the first one that gets the bubble canopy, and it also gets a nice strengthened long stroke undercarriage. So it's the first Seafire that really kind of deals with that undercarriage issue that's been a problem from the very outset. It's got a slightly strengthened airframe, and it's just generally more sorted than some of the earlier models. It still has a few of the typical Seafire problems. The view for landing is not great. It never is on any Seafire model really, but the Fleet Air Arm learns to live with it and develops ways around those problems. But it's a decent aircraft, but it's a little bit outmoded even by the standards of the Sea Fury. The Sea Fury is a better aircraft than the Seafire 17. Vickers Supermarine keeps pushing, and you get this sort of the definitive Seafire, which is based on the wing of the Spitfire 21 and 24 and those late Mark Spitfires, which have the different wing. And this is known as the Seafire 47, and it's got a contra rotating propeller, which cuts out any swing on takeoff or acceleration, which is a big issue with the Seafire, and means you don't get the torque problems. It sorts out a lot of issues. It's a lot heavier. It carries a bit more fuel, so it's a bit more capable. You've got things like rocket projectiles as standard, which cameras as standard, which makes it a fairly capable aircraft. And if it weren't for the Sea Fury waiting in the wings, then the Seafire 47 would have, it would have probably been a good fighter into the 50s. And even then, it was better at high altitude than the Sea Fury, which was kind of less importance at that point. But it was a good machine, and it did actually hang on into the Korean War. It was still in service with a few squadrons, and it happened to be on HMS Triumph with 800 Squadron, which was the carrier out in the Far East when war in Korea broke out. And also, actually, it had done a bit of work in Malaya when you had the Malayan emergency going on at the time, and they were doing some ground attack work alongside the RAF in Malaya. And then when Korea breaks out in 1950, Triumph's on station. So you have Seafire goes to war again, which is you know, 5 years after the end of the Second World War, it's still doing that, still performing that function.
Yeah, and it's obviously quite a lot smaller than the Sea Fury, which I suspect made storage issues somewhat easier. Because having seen the Seafire they've got at the Fleet Air Arm Museum, and then seen the Sea Fury that Navy wings have, it's night and day. You're almost reminded of actually in the same hangar they've got a little tiger moth, which is incongruously parked up against a swordfish, and you realize the size difference between the two, and it's not quite that bad, but it's almost as much comparing the two.
There's it's a much bulkier aircraft, the Sea Fury as well, which you know, it folded down fairly compactly for an aircraft. You know, when you compare it to something like a Firebrand, it was a lot smaller with the same engine. But yeah, I mean, it was. So it was still sort of useful for combat air patrol. Again, this sort of perennial thing that the Seafire gets pushed into with the cap, that it was useful for that in Korea to the, you know, there was with you know, fairly tragic results at one point when it was sent to intercept an unidentified bogey, which turned out to be a B-29. And the Seafire was investigating this B-29, and the B-29 fired on the Seafire and killed the pilot, which was pretty unfortunate. But you know, it showed that it was capable of intercepting a B-29, which there probably weren't many piston-engined bombers around at the time that could do that. And you know, it was also used on some ground attack sorties with rocket projectiles, and sort of as an escort fighter for the Fireflies, which were the other aircraft that were in use at the time. I mean, it was useful having these late generation Seafires for the Fleet Air Arm, because they were still working on their carriers that were capable of carrying jets, and because, you know, Britain was in a financially tough position after the war and was taking a little bit longer to develop naval jets than the US Navy had. So, you know, it was propeller aircraft was still competitive at this point. So it was, and the light fleet carriers, which were the smaller carriers, which were coming into service right at the end of the Second World War. Their air group was usually made up of initially Seafires and older Mark Fireflies, and then Sea Furies and later Mark Fireflies. So they could fit in the hangar basically, which some of the larger aircraft that were developed for naval use couldn't do. Firebrands wouldn't fit in the hangar of the light fleets. So it was still proving useful at that point. And then it started to have some of the same issues that the Seafire had always had, and the attrition in deck landing and the conditions they were operating in off the coast of Korea, particularly in the winter, was not great. You know, rough seas, cold weather, high winds, and the attrition that the Seafires were suffering during that operation started to tell once again. And you know, they started to run down the reserve of aircraft that were in stationed in Hong Kong, and really then by the time it got to the point that they'd run down most of the available Seafires, and that was what brought Triumph's time on station to an end, and really the frontline career of the Seafire. The only other sort of frontline use that it had was the Mark 17, which I mentioned earlier, which is the Mark that the Navy Wings has just taken on an example of, was used quite heavily for the Royal Navy Reserve squadrons, and it was their sort of weekend warrior squadrons, which you know, kept pilots and crews in shape should they need to be brought back into a combat role. The Seafire 17 was quite a good aircraft for that purpose. It was you know, quite useful it didn't have some of the problems of the earlier ones. It was more suitable for operation by more inexperienced pilots. And it's a pleasant aircraft to fly. It served quite well, quite quietly in those reserve squadrons, sort of into the 1950s.
So the career of the Seafire actually goes on considerably longer than you might otherwise expect, given that, when you think about piston engine fighters in the Korean War, everyone goes, oh yeah, of course, Bearcats, Sea Furies, that kind of thing. The Seafire is still going on quite happily there in the background, which I suppose it's a testament to the fact that, although they haven't solved all the issues, it still remains a fairly high performance aircraft, and with most of the issues worked out, it's still worthy of a frontline role at that point.
Yeah, I mean, very much so. I mean, the Seafire 47 was double the weight of the early Mark 1 Spitfire, and yet was still based distantly on the same basic design. It was still an excellent high altitude fighter by piston engine standards. It still had some. I think part of the problem with adding that much weight, I mean, so what was the 2.5 times the power of the early Mark 1 Spitfire as well. It's remarkable to think that you can load up a design like that and still keep modifying the design to be not just a functioning aircraft, but an actually reasonably capable one. So it's quite remarkable, really, that was possible. I mean, it was some of the handling issues had deteriorated. It wasn't a particularly pleasant aircraft to fly, the Mark 47, compared to the earlier marks. Center of gravity was an issue. It had quite tight tolerances on how you could load it, so it didn't. The center of gravity didn't come far too far back. So a few kind of compromises were starting to come out, and a few little wrinkles that sort of showed that you just couldn't keep pushing this design forever. But then, Vickers Supermarines they've been trying to develop a naval fighter with a new design, a different wing, called the Sea Fang, which had this sort of wasn't exactly a laminar flow wing, but this sort of low compressibility wing, and that had proved that the Navy had tested that back to back with the Seafire 47 and decided that the Seafire was preferable, was the one to go for. It had better handling, better deck landing capabilities, and just all round slightly favourable to the newer aircraft. So that was it still had a few things up its sleeve, even that late in the day.
Okay, well, thank you very much for telling us all about the Seafire. Certainly a few new things for me to learn about it, even having already read your book. So that's all good. And of course, if you don't have a copy of that particular book, which is, of course, Fleet Air Legends, the Supermarine Seafire, you can get it from all sorts of major retailers. But of course, if you can do, which is probably more for us in the UK than anywhere else, but if you can do, I would personally suggest maybe getting it from the Navy Wing shop, because you'll get exactly the same book. But of course, that means that Navy Wings themselves will get a cut of the sale price, which is always good because, as you mentioned, they've got a Seafire now they've got to fix up, and there's plenty of other aircraft they need to keep running. And as those of you who also watch military aviation history will have seen, Chris and myself were welcomed down there last year, and we were able to see and film their existing collection at that point. We will be back at some point to look at the Seafire, but Chris has already put out videos on the Sea Vixen and the Sea Fury and the Swordfish. I'll be doing one on the Swordfish as well, and then who knows, maybe later in the year there'll be one on the Seafire, which will be quite fun because the closest I've gotten to one so far is the one that's in the Fleet Air Arm Museum, which unhelpfully is tucked at the back of its little section, almost hiding behind a wildcat. So once again, thank you very much to Matthew Willis for sharing his expertise, and hope you've all enjoyed the video, and see you all again later on.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.